some really pertinent topics that are being discussed this morning. One of them is, of course, today is the last day of the 16 days of activism as far as GBV is concerned. And we're going to be talking to Mike, who is a registered social worker and co-founder and CEO of the Restorative Justice Centre. He's going to be talking to us about the calls for action to strengthen peace building and conflict transformation in South Africa. He's also going to be discussing the aspect of GBV. As we know, this is a different take on having to deal with GBV. In many cases, people end up in court, and he's going to talk to us about that different take of where we can so-called amicably sort out the solutions and pen forward something. Thank you so much. A very good morning to you, Mr. Mike Batley. Thank you so much for joining us this morning on News and Views.
Good morning, Afisa. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Let's talk about restorative justice. As we know with GBV, it is a very serious case of issues going on. It's rife in many communities as we, go and do some research. Today, we're going to discuss the different approach that you bring about to be able to discuss issues that can be pertinently brought together with two people in a room, and of course creating that environment where you amicably become a version of sorting that particular issue out without major conflict.
Yeah, I think if we could just start at the beginning and perhaps clarify what we mean when we use the term restorative justice, and then I'll get to its application in the GBV situations. So restorative justice is an approach to justice that emphasizes healing, repair, making things right, as opposed to just imposing punishment. Often when people hear the word restorative justice and that concept of making things right, they immediately think, oh, this is a soft approach to justice. And what we need is to fight fire with fire and really be tough on crime. So I want to emphasize that restorative justice is not intended to be an easy option. It's not intended to let people off. What it is intended to be is to focus on who got hurt. It's intended to focus on harm and how do we address those harms and the people that got hurt. But then with that, how do we create an environment that enables offenders, perpetrators to accept responsibility? Because that's never easy for any of us. So how do we hold them accountable? How do we help them to be responsible, but to create a supportive environment to do that and to help them explore what it means to accept that responsibility for harmful behavior?
Yeah, I think that kind of pens it out better in the sense that we know that, restorative justice actually, should we say, pins out a better version of, as you're saying, the perpetrator then will understand. Do they go into a rehabilitation process with yourselves?
Well, let's just proceed along a couple of the steps. So we make distinctions between a restorative justice process, that idea of bringing the parties together in a form of dialogue or mediation, and other steps to help people change their behavior. So I think a restorative justice process, first of all, to be clear again, that can be done at any point in the criminal justice system. So as an alternative to a crime, as part of the sentencing process, or indeed then after somebody who has been sentenced, maybe spent time in jail, and that dialogue can still be held to resolve outstanding questions, concerns that people have, and to maybe find some sort of closure, maybe even forgiveness and reconciliation. So that engagement is an opportunity for people who've had a violent incident. In an intimate relationship, maybe there's been a history or context, and a violent incident has occurred. And they've gone to court. They've laid a complaint to the police, they've gone to court, and the prosecutor then has the discretion to refer it at that point or a process like that, or whether the trial should proceed further. One of the outcomes of that engagement could be referral to other programs. So we refer people often to some training in non-violent communication, so where people can learn to communicate in a more peaceful way. But obviously there can be a range of issues that are fed into this violent incident. So alcohol, substance abuse generally can play a big part. Often couple counseling, helping people understand the dynamics in their relationship, is also very important.
And there are, of course, principles, as far as restorative justice is concerned. There are approaches. I mean, it's the victim-centered approach. And then, of course, looking into the accountability of the offender. And then the reparation, which is the offender makes amends for the harm that he's caused. So I think it's more that awakening with making the person understand that what they've done is not acceptable. And then, of course, the reintegration process. And I think that's important because what happens is then when they do get reintegrated, it's making them understand that that mindset has to change and the behavioral patterns have to change in accordance with what has actually transpired. Because if you look at GBV on a whole, I would say, Mike, it is something that is habitual. Once it starts, that pattern does not really end in a hurry.
Well, I think we need to make some careful distinctions here. The literature actually talks about common couple violence. So the conflicts that all couples experience, we regard conflict as a normal part of life. And so working out that conflict, and sometimes that could get violent, but that's very different to what the literature calls intimate terrorism. So somebody who has a personality of really controlling and dominating, limiting the behavior of another person. From our perspective, we don't think that somebody who is engaging in intimate terrorism would be a good candidate for a restorative justice process. But the other context, where something's arisen out of common couple violence, those situations are generally quite well suited to a restorative justice process.
Let's talk about the benefits. And this is what I want our audience to understand this morning, the difference between just going to a normal counseling session and going to a restorative justice session where there are many benefits that are put into place and then that comes out of what you are really doing.
Yeah, I think especially in the context of couple conflict, there is a close connection between this kind of dialogue, mediation, and counseling, but there is definitely a very clear distinction. So I think it's helpful to see a mediation session as a platform to stop and take stock, to say, so we've had some trouble in our relationship, this incident has happened, what do we do now? So time for explanation of how each person experienced that, what were some of the triggers that led into that, and then to decide, well, where do we go from here? Do we want to continue to invest in this relationship, or is this? Do we realize that perhaps the relationship is becoming toxic and we don't want to proceed? And then how are we going to end this constructively? So I think that's the main benefit of having a mediation process as a way of resolving a violent incident. And if the couple then decides to take it further, to continue the relationship, then referral to a qualified counsellor would be a good idea, and then they can go deeper into what are the dynamics that have brought them to this point, so what are the things that they need to work on in their relationship.
What if in the instance we have a GBV case where one of the spouses have passed on? How do you deal with that, where the perpetrator is still around, but there's a victim that has passed on due to the incident of GBV?
So that would probably be after there's been a trial. If a person has been killed, and then presumably the person would have spent some time in prison, perhaps, or at least in correctional supervision. And the opportunity then would be for the rest of the family to have a facilitated dialogue with the perpetrator. And I must emphasize that this is always voluntary. There should never be any pressure applied to anyone to participate in a process like this. Obviously, you need to understand what it's about so you can make an informed choice, and that could take some time. But I think that the value that a process like this would have would be for family members to confront the perpetrator with how they feel about what happened, perhaps ask questions about how did it get to this, and more broadly, just for a time of open dialogue. And I think that can be very healing for all concerned. So there could be reconciliation in a situation like that, But that is something that would arise out of that engagement, and which would never be driven saying you've got to forgive or you've got to reconcile. It would be something that could arise out of that engagement, and that is very much a personal choice and something part of people's own healing journeys.
I think it's imperative to make our audience understand this morning that you have trained facilitators that actually deal with this particular aspect of things, and there is safety and support measures that are being put into place as far as GBV is concerned, and the Restorative Justice Centre assists with that.
Correct. So we do an assessment when we get a referral from the court. If we feel that this is not safe, then we would not proceed with a process like this. We would refer to the court or to another service provider who could engage in different ways. But checking the safety aspect and making sure that the victim, especially, is comfortable with proceeding with the process on an informed basis would be critical.
I really like the concept of what you've brought to the fore through the Restorative Justice Centre as far as GBV is concerned. Reason being is, you've given us, should we say, the amicable alternative to be able to deal with the processes and the issues that people face within the GBV context. I think that's important.
Yes, it is. And I think that, we put way too much store in the role that punishment can play, and we expect too much from it. And I think recognizing that conflict is normal, and it's part of our own growth and development, individually and in a relationship, to work those difficulties out. It remains contentious because there is the risk of feeding into the pattern of domestic violence. But there's a lot of international and some local research that has looked at this and is demonstrating the benefits of that. And for your viewers, if they look at our website, under the resources page, there are two research reports that have looked at our cases and got feedback from the participants, both victims and offenders.
Interesting enough, you bring out that pattern, and in many cases of GBV, you see that pattern happening all the time. How is it that you can give some advice to people that are out there that are in this particular situation and don't know how to pull out of it? In many cases, I speak to people that are going through GBV, and you find that they're stuck in a particular spot and they don't know how to pull themselves out and actually get that aid. Where do they start? Is the Restorative Justice Centre the place that they need to contact to be able to get assistance as they require? In many cases with GBV, you find, the physical abuse is really bad.
Yeah, we don't see ourselves as a specialist GBV organization. We're specialists in restorative justice and restorative justice processes. So I think that if people are experiencing violence and concerned about, feeling maybe even caged in that sense of being controlled, they should speak to a marriage counselor. And there are a number of agencies at a local level. FAMSA is the big national organization. But the Department of Social Development also offers those services. And I think it is important to stress that there's never any excuse for intimate partner violence. So if somebody is struggling with that or just feeling uncomfortable, because it's obviously not only the physical violence either, it's also the emotional, mental, the financial, the spiritual control that is sometimes harder to become aware of and to say, but actually this is not okay, and to stand up against that. So I would encourage anybody who's struggling with that to reach out to a qualified marriage counselor.
I want to actually steer a little bit away there. Restorative justice is not just only in the GBV area. You're dealing with many aspects of it, and I know you're dealing with the inmates as well. Is to be able to understand, make them understand, where they've gone wrong, where they've steered off the path, and of course, making them understand how they can move into a better space and rehabilitate them to be able to be integrated into society as a better person than what they were before, and making them understand where they had steered off that path.
Correct. Absolutely. That this is not limited to GBV. It can actually be done in any crime situation. So We have a lot of assault cases. Not so much at the moment, but previously we've dealt with a lot of theft and damage to property cases as well. And again, if we understand that these processes can be done as an alternative to a trial, as part of a sentence, and then post-sentence, then I think one can begin to see the options and the possibilities that it holds for problem solving, but also to help people to, well, first of all, to address the harm that people have suffered, but then to help people change their behavior, as you said. Now, again, we are not specialists in offender reintegration, but this is part of that. So sometimes we would then refer to other organizations. Again, the big national organization is NICRO, that specializes in offender reintegration. But there are a range of community organizations as well. We're in a partnership with a group of other organizations like Kulisa Social Solutions and Restore in Cape Town. So all of those kinds of organizations are focused on supporting people to change their behavior. And if I could just add, when it is at the point of somebody having spent time in prison, we all know the conditions in prison and the limited resources and the pressure that the overcrowding puts on people in prison. But ideally, they would then go through a rehabilitation path, that as Correctional Services calls it, and have attended a number of courses, gone through their own counseling journey while in prison, and would be ready as they're coming up for parole to acknowledge their own part, to accept responsibility, and to really apologize in a very meaningful and authentic way to all the people that they've hurt.
I think that's a phenomenal aspect of it. And I mean, I know you've published several books, and of course, restorative justice has been quoted in Superior Court judgments as well, which I think is important, because it's not just the element, as you say, of punishing, but making people understand where they've steered off that path, as I said. And of course, bringing basic guidelines into place. And I think the most important one is the strategy for strengthening child justice, because I think a lot of the times that's where we have a bridge in the gap. And I think that's what you've done, is just bridge that gap to make people understand that restorative justice is not just being used in one particular space, but in many spaces. And I think child justice is one of them. As we see, there's many rife issues going on in different communities where children are also being affected as far as the GBV aspect is concerned.
100% correct. In fact, the child justice sector was the pathway for restorative justice into South Africa. And the Child Justice Act is very explicit in its objectives about the connecting with restorative justice. And then the Act makes specific provision for restorative justice processes at a pre-trial and a pre-sentence stage. So I think that's important for people to realize that this is not just something we're talking about here. It has really been taken up in our legislation. And also, as you said, in the court judgments. So it's absolutely endorsed by the criminal justice system and our statutory law.
I want to commend you on that, because the thing is, a lot of the times we don't look at the alternate, should we say, amicable versions of doing things. And I think this is one way to be able to do it, where people actually, it creates an awakening of that subconscious for them to understand that, this is what I've done wrong, and this is how I'm going to fix it, as opposed to just punishing them and making them. I think what happens is in the instance of these kinds of perpetrators is when we punish them, we don't actually make them realize where they've steered off that path. And this is what you really do. And I think that's imperative, is being able to create those holistic individuals that come out from there and have been rehabilitated in the sense to be able to be better human beings.
That's why we believe restorative justice should be central to our criminal justice system. Punishment in itself is really not an answer. And we see that in the fact that it's not effective in responding to crime.
Yes, I really want to thank you so much for joining us. What would you like to leave us with this morning?
Well, we're entering the season of reconciliation, with Reconciliation Day coming up next week. So I would encourage everyone to buy into the vision of dialogue and invest in the process of dialogue, and not be surprised at how much can be resolved through a restorative approach to dialogue.
I think you've left us with some really insightful food for thought. Thank you so much for joining me this morning on News and Views. I really appreciate you taking the time out to join us. Stay blessed. Have a really good day. Thank you so much.
I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you very much.
Take care. Bye-bye. That was Mike Batley from the Restorative Justice Centre talking to us about alternate ways of making people understand where they've steered off the path. And I think that's important. It's not about just punishing somebody, but making them rehabilitate themselves into understanding that there can be a better version of themselves through the restorative justice system. Stick with us. We're going to be back with you in a moment. We're just going to go for a short break.